Being a graduate of Cambridge is not all it's cracked up to be. I'll tell you why. Anyone who graduates from Cambridge eventually gets an MA after their name. It doesn't mean that they've spent the requisite time studying for their MA. When you come out with your BA, you then sit around and do nothing for the next 6 years, and then they send you a letter and they say, according to the ancient statute granted to us by King Henry the... you have to pay the sum of £6 and 5 pence to receive your MA. So you sign a cheque and you get it. But I did get my BA from the sweat of my brow. So it's a great pleasure to see you all here. It is a fabulously large crowd. I'm very used to speaking to crowds of 10 or less. And we're gathered in this fabulous country club with a view of Denver behind us, so it couldn't be better. Just to return to myself, because I love speaking about myself. When I was a child, as you've just heard, I was sent away to boarding school. And in most countries, you're sent away only if you're a delinquent. Parents do this as a last resort, with immense reluctance. Not so in England. It's a little better now, but when I was a child, to dispatch your little darling to a freezing cold institution staffed by sadists hundreds of miles away was considered the height of good parenting. We internal exiles knew little of the world in our cloistered boarding houses with our Latin and our cricket and the perennial threat of the cane across our backsides, but our minds were expanded immeasurably on a Saturday night, the only night of the week when it was permitted to watch television. And this was my first blissful contact with Denver, Colorado. For the highlight of Saturday night TV was the soap opera Dynasty. And from this we learned what life was like for ordinary people in Denver. Murder and jealousy, huge bank accounts, heroic shoulder pads. The men never lost their hair, it turned cobalt blue. The women improved with age, fabulous. So I'm very pleased to be here and test the truth of what I know. We're going to be talking about Iran, so we'll laugh less in the next half an hour. I suspect that many people here will have seen the film Argo. I know that some of you have because we were discussing it earlier over dinner. And for Denverites, there may be something strangely familiar about the view that Ben Affleck gives us of the Iranian capital, Tehran, with that great bank of snow-capped mountains rising in the background. I can tell you that the grid template that was used by Tehran planners in the modern era is another point of similarity. I first went to Iran in 2000, and there were enough ancient Buicks and Caddies which had been purchased before the revolution, rolling and sighing over the ruts in the road for one to think that you were in 1970s America. Yes, there was a great deal for Americans to recognize in the city of Tehran. And surprising though it may seem, this remains the case. We all know the reasons why America is different from other countries, exceptional. Iran is also different and exceptional. And although some of you know the reasons why, I'm just going to remind you of them. The Middle East is mostly Arab. Iran is not Arab. Middle Easterners mostly speak Arabic. Iranians do not. They speak Persian or Farsi. The Middle East was mostly colonized by Europeans. Iran was not. Arab civilization and language emerged from tribes and the desert. It took over much of the world because of the religion that it was used to propel Islam. Iran's civilization was metropolitan, and it flowered long before Islam. Back in the day when the Iranians, or Persians, you can use both terms, were the rivals of Rome for dominance over the Western world. Religion, statecraft, communications. The ancient Persians were innovators in all. Iran accepted Islam, but it adapted it, eventually turning to the Shia sect, the minority sect, and making it its own. So for cultural, racial, and sectarian reasons, Iran has been prevented from forming a close identification with the Arabs around them, both Sunni and Shia. So remember that when Iran climbs into bed with Hamas, or Bashar Assad, or Hezbollah, Iran has no permanent friend. It has only tactical allies. By the same token, it would be wrong to think of Iran having permanent enemies. There is no inherent reason why Iran should be more extreme in its antipathy to Israel than the Arabs whose land was lost with the formation of the Jewish state. There is no reason why Iran should be on worse terms with the United States than, for example, Egypt or even Turkey. To the outside world, these enmities seem as though they're written in stone, but they're not. I'm on a book tour, as you've just heard, for a new book, Patriot of Persia, Mohammad Mossadegh and a Tragic Anglo-American Coup. I want to talk a little bit about the past, so I'm going to talk about the subject of this book and a few other things, because I think that they cast an important and valuable light on what's happening now. Now, Mossadegh was Prime Minister of Iran back in the 1950s. He loathed the British, who had set up Iran's oil industry, but gave the Iranians a paltry royalty, and used their control over oil as a means of exerting control over the country as a whole, manipulating governments, toppling and setting them up. In 1951, Mossadegh nationalized the Iranian oil industry, and the British were furious. They imposed an oil embargo on the country along with the Americans, all the while pressing for the return of Iranian oil to British control. Mossadegh refused, and in 1953, the British persuaded the Eisenhower administration to launch a coup d'etat against him in favor of the Shah. The coup plan, as devised by the CIA, was hideous. It called for maximum loss of life and contained ample provision for civil war. That these were avoided was down to the personality of Mossadegh himself. He was a pacifist, and he refused to be drawn into a fight to the death. The coup had even graver long-term consequences. Over the next quarter of a century, the Shah was able to build, with American support, his shiny dictatorship. But as he became hated by many ordinary Iranians, so too did his American backers. The US had once been popular among Iranians. They had seen in the new superpower an attractive alternative to the traditional colonial powers, Britain and Russia. But the events of August 1953 downed America in Iranian eyes. The United States had queered the course of history, causing boundless ill will to the future. And the Iranians got their revenge. They overthrew the Shah in 1979, and some of them went into the US embassy. Now, to much of the world, here and elsewhere, the actions of those students were a rank offense against honor and decency. In the view of most Iranians, however, the coup was a justified comeuppance after years of American interference. In the course of interrogating their captives, the hostage takers reproached the Americans for the coup against Mossadegh back in '53. One captured CIA agent remarked that he and a colleague were treated as if they were, as he put it, surrogates for the CIA of 1953. Unable to punish those involved in the 1953 coup, the Iranians took out their anger on us. So I've written my book about a man who was born in 1882 and who occupied the center of world affairs 60 years ago. Why do you think my publishers were attracted to this book in the first place? And the reviewers who have written generously about it? And the Washington Center for Near Eastern Studies, which recently awarded it a prize? They regard it as topical. They realize that for Iranians, history bleeds, just as it bleeds for anyone who is lost. So in reading this book of history, they hope to understand the Iran of today. For the US, the hostage crisis also bleeding history. By my count, around 40 books have been written about the hostage crisis. Overwhelmingly, they have not been written by Iranians, but by Americans, searching for a meaning and lessons from the disaster. Ben Affleck did something clever. He found a silver lining, the exfiltration of embassy staff under the noses of the Iranians. But anyone watching that film knows that the small triumph of the exfiltration cannot obscure the much larger story of American defeat and humiliation. Why am I here to talk about contemporary Iran and talking about 53 and 79? The reason is that the history of relations between Iran and the United States stopped abruptly with the hostage crisis, and that event continues to dominate the landscape. Our view of Iran-US relations makes no place for the state visits, commercial transactions, and honest cultural misunderstandings that have the effect of keeping ties between nations in a constant state of flux and renewal. No, what we see is a barren tableland strung with barbed wire and unexploded bombs, with two massive carbuncular growths rising in the middle, throwing their distorted shadows. One of these mountains is marked 1979 and the other 1953. Shortly after Patriot of Persia came out, I was interviewed by NPR's Steve Inskeep, and he told me of the last time that he'd visited Tehran, when an Iranian he met remarked that relations between the two countries could only be normalized if the Americans stopped remembering 79 and the Iranians stopped obsessing about 53. And there is something in this idea. History should not be allowed to obscure the logic of the present. The American present is full of antagonisms that have been allowed to wither. And the Iranians, as I have suggested, are not hardwired to hate America. Indeed, a great many ordinary Iranians express pro-American sentiments. It's time, I believe, for the historical traumas to be replaced by a more hopeful, conciliatory present. And I want later on to present some ideas about how this might happen. But before I do so, I should say that I'm not advocating forgetting the past, only putting it into a proper perspective. We should know and learn about 53 and 79, for only knowing about them can we learn to set them aside. And this leads me, if you'll forgive me, into a short digression about Tony Blair. As a Briton, it never ceases to amaze me that Tony Blair managed to convince the American people that he was a man of substance. One of Blair's singular achievements was to go through most of his tenure unaware that there ever existed a man called Mohammad Mossadegh. And he wasn't leading a blameless existence in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. He was dealing every day with the Iranian situation, and people were coming to him and asking what Britain should do. And I find it extraordinary that no one told him about Mossadegh. Anyway, a distinguished journalist friend of mine suggested to Blair, towards the end of his tenure, that the Iranians were perhaps angry with the British, partly as a result of 1953 and our role in the coup. And Blair said, well, what is this coup? So he was explained what it was, and he said, oh, they're not still banging on about that, are they? So how do we get from here to a more hopeful future? Let's start with the current state of play. Most people in this room are familiar with America's beef with Iran, but let's remind ourselves. I don't need to tell you that Iran has a civilian nuclear program that could, if the leadership wanted, be diverted to military use. Iran, of course, insists it does not want a weapon. The Supreme Leader has declared that Iran will, as he put it, never possess nuclear weapons because the Islamic Republic logically, religiously, and theoretically considers the possession of nuclear weapons to be a grave sin. But many in the West do not believe the Supreme Leader, or they expect him to rescind his ruling if the occasion arises. I don't need to tell you that Iran's leaders would prefer the State of Israel not to exist, and that they support groups like Hamas and Hezbollah that threaten and attack the Jewish state. And then there is Iran's human rights record, which speaks for itself. Clearly, there is an ideological contest between a revolutionary republic with an institutionalized antipathy to many Western values and the main source of those values. But more important than the ideological aspect, I believe, is the strategic aspect of the rivalry. With the demise of the Soviet Union and the defenestration of Saddam, Iran has become the United States' main competitor in the Middle East. It has been a big winner from the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, raising its prestige, influence, and economic penetration in those countries. It may end up a loser in Syria, where it seems to have backed the wrong horse, but even this is too early to tell. Iranian officials preside over a brittle political system at home. Abroad, they have leadership pretensions. Let me interrupt myself here to say that in America and elsewhere, there are many who long for a regime change in Iran. For a regime to come along that would be friendly to America and not obstruct its interests. This might be a dangerous illusion. No matter what the regime in Iran, if it had any popular legitimacy, it would still be nationalistic and a regional competitor to the United States. It would not abandon its nuclear weapon. I say this not on the basis of manifestos and policy statements that have yet to be issued, but on the basis of a decade and a half of intimate knowledge of Iran and its people. So much then for the American beef with Iran. Now I'd like you to put yourself in Iranian shoes. President Obama comes to power and promises a new era of cooperation and mutual respect. This is all very nice, but at the same time, the US Department of Commerce girds itself for an unrestricted economic campaign against Iran. We're not simply talking about the sanctions that the US, the EU, and other countries have imposed, or the UN sanctions regime. We're talking about pressure being exerted by US officials of all kinds on any entity, public or private, doing substantial business with Iran. The threat runs as follows: if you do business with Iran, don't think about doing this business with us. And as we know from the number of international companies that have stopped doing business with Iran, as a result, it's taken very seriously. Now, in theory, carefully punched humanitarian holes exist in the sanctions regime for medicines and foodstuffs, even private remittances through the banking system. In practice, many companies and banks prefer to end all transactions with Iran of any kind rather than negotiate this minefield. This is why the price of medicines has been soaring in Tehran and why many are no longer available. Why hospital machines are breaking down from a lack of spare parts. And it's why, to cite an example closer to home, Iranian students in Minnesota were this week informed by their US bank that their accounts were being closed. You may be aware that in the autumn of last year, the Iranian currency, the rial, lost half its value, that inflation is estimated at anything between 25 and 75%, and that Iran's oil revenues have dropped sharply. This is not entirely down to sanctions, but it is substantially down to sanctions. 4 nuclear scientists have been assassinated, by whom we cannot be sure. The sale of aircraft and even spare parts for Iranian civilian airliners remains prohibited. Each time an ancient Iran Air 747 lumbers into the air, sometimes with me on it, a conflagration is waiting to happen. Cyber attacks are launched. The diplomatic offensive is without relent. This is war by another name. So you will understand if Iran's leaders are not convinced by US assertions that its policy is other than regime change. You'll understand if they think the US is trying to impoverish the people so they rise against the leadership. In fact, considerable ambiguity surrounds sanctions and the reason for them. The peaceniks regard sanctions as preferable to war. The war party regards sanctions as a preamble to war. There are precedents. I'd like you to cast your minds back to the sanctions regime that was imposed on Saddam Hussein after the First Gulf War. Education, health, the middle class, all destroyed. Saddam and his cronies, no less powerful, arguably more powerful because they control the distribution of humanitarian assistance allowed in by the UN, their thumb over the nation's gullet. And of course, they're able to blame America and the West for the country's suffering. I submit that if sanctions go on and Iran's isolation increases, the country will start to resemble Iraq in the 1990s. The private sector has already been hammered by the severance of international credit and the rise in the price of imports. And the private sector, I should say here, is composed of people whose worldview and values most resembles those of the West. 10 years ago, Iran's economy was liberalizing. Now things are going in the opposite direction. The system is becoming less transparent. Economic control is becoming ever more centralized, and the military establishment runs huge swathes of what has become, in fact, a war economy. The sanctions were designed in order to harm the leaders, those who determine the country's nuclear policy. But I don't see that happening. Don't take it from me, take it from a recent congressional report on the subject. I quote, "Sanctions have not to date accomplished their core strategic objective of compelling Iran to verifiably limit its nuclear development to purely peaceful purposes." So what have they accomplished? It seems to me that the main benefit of sanctions has been to dissuade Israel from attacking Iran. I should spell out how disastrous such an attack would be. An Israeli attack would be enough to damage the Iranian program, but not to kill it. In fact, nuclear know-how, once acquired, cannot be unacquired. An attack might prompt the Iranians to go hell for leather for a bomb. It would certainly invite retaliation, plunging the Middle East into more chaos and imperiling economic recovery everywhere. To prevent Iran from reviving its program, the Israelis or the US or both would have to launch periodic attacks on Iran. The prospect is of a war without end, a nightmare for the world, perhaps even more nightmarish than Iraq and Afghanistan. For me, an outsider, certain aspects of American foreign policy remain a puzzle. I should say here a few words about Israel and the way its policies and interests seem to have become entangled, intertwined with those of the United States. If Israel were to launch a unilateral attack on Iran, even one that the US strenuously opposed, the Iranians would regard the strike as having emanated from Israel and the US, both of them. They would feel entitled to attack US targets and interests at will. So the US finds itself in an odd position of carrying the can, potentially, for the actions of an ally, even if it disapproves of those actions. This should sound warning bells everywhere. For this arrangement endows the smaller country with disproportionate powers of leverage. It's constricting and it prevents full use of the political imagination. Imagination, vision, call it what you want. Marshall had it when he rebuilt Europe. Nixon had it when he went to China. It's what we'd like to see now from Iran's leaders and America's. Because the difficulty of rolling back decades of institutionalized enmity should not be underestimated. Lifting and rescinding 9 congressional acts and 25 executive orders concerning sanctions would entail an enormous act of will. The peace lobby would be opposed every inch of the way. And I can tell you it would be just as difficult in Iran. Because there, the prize of an honorable peace with America, an honorable peace, not capitulation, is a very real one. And it is in fact so tantalizing that every time a leader in that fractured political system wants to reach a peace, his rivals will inevitably try and sabotage it. So that's another challenge on the road. I should say here that if you look at the nuclear issue and the way that the negotiations have been going, you can see the parameters for a deal. They are in fact fairly obvious. Iran would restrict itself to uranium enrichment to a point where they would not be allowed, where they would not be able to build a bomb. they would subject themselves to far more intrusive scrutiny and inspection by UN inspectors, opening up parts of the complex, the nuclear complex, that have hitherto remained closed. And the Americans, on the other side, would, with their allies, start incrementally but swiftly lifting sanctions. And these things need to happen at the same time. You cannot say to the Iranians, you do this and then we'll do it later. Again, this goes back to this legacy of mistrust. It's like playing rock, paper, scissors. You've got to do it at the same time. Now, there's talk this year that 2013 is going to be the year that the Iran issue is resolved once and for all. And 2012 was going to be the year, and before that, 2011. I'm not sure that this is the case. What I see is there is another alternative other than an attack and other than a deal. And I fear that this alternative may prove to be the reality. And that is that sanctions are ratcheted up further, they become yet more crippling. And in fact, sanctions become, rather than a tool of policy, the policy itself. That's one of the things that I'm worried about. A lot of people in this room are in the private sector, were in the private sector, or are intimately connected with the private sector. And I often feel that the private sector and pressure from the private sector in both countries could be a great aid in bringing people together and renewing those bonds that existed before the revolution. I was speaking to people here earlier this evening who remembered friends from before the revolution, Iranians who'd been and visited, and which could bring pressure to bear on the political class. And I remember, and I think that it's an important moment in this awful decline that's taken place in relations. 2005, it's the year when a subsidiary of Conoco won a tender to exploit 2 Iranian oil fields. It would have been the first involvement, big scale involvement by American oil companies in Iran since the revolution. And it would have been a game changer. And unfortunately, it was vetoed by President Clinton. Since then, there have been memos and overtures and ships crossing in the night. Because when Iran makes an overture, the Americans think that the Iranians are doing it out of weakness, and they think if they apply more pressure, there will be capitulation. And when America makes an overture, the Iranians remember the time that their overture was rebuffed, and they say, no, we're not having anything to do with it. All of this goes to show and underlies my point that trying to end this situation in a vacuum, where there is no person-to-person contact, where there are no sporting contacts, where there is so little in the way of academic interaction, where there are no Iranians invited to this forum to give their opinion and to talk to you and sit and break bread with you. This is this cultural vacuum that makes it so difficult to achieve a deal. And I know that for many Americans, Iran it's like Mars. It is so distant, you have been so distanced from it, that it must be difficult to even conceive of how people live there. The media is so relentless in its vilification. It picks up so unerringly the worst aspects of Iran and ignores with such determination anything good that might come out of the country, that you must be thoroughly alienated. And if you feel a residual hostility to Iran, it's perfectly understandable, because again, you're not being given the full information. I want to end just by telling you the story of an American who got into the country recently on a tourist visa. It does happen, it doesn't happen that often. Somehow they let him in. So I met him quite by chance later on, and he said he'd been hitchhiking. He was a young student. He'd always been fascinated by Iran. He was hitchhiking around the country. The country, by the way, is one of the safest places in the world to travel around. He was hitchhiking around the country. He was standing at a bus stop, and there was an old lady in her chador standing next to him. And she put her hand into her bag and brought out her mobile, and she dialed the number, and she yabbered away. And then suddenly she approached him and handed him the phone. So he took the phone and he said hello. And a male voice at the other end of the line said, "This is my mother's phone. She doesn't speak English, but she wants me to pass on a message to you." "Yeah. She says that you're looking very thin and you need to come home and have dinner tonight." Thank you very much.
Can you expound a little bit more on your book? Just get a little some.
The book is a biography. This man, Mohammad Mossadegh, who for 2.5 years really was the center of world affairs. He came to America. In fact, he wooed America. He came to America and said that, in fact, we're in a similar position to the colonists in 1776, and the Americans responded very, very favorably to him. It's a cradle-to-grave biography of this guy who's never been given the Anglo-Saxon cradle-to-grave biography treatment. But it's a life and time, so you start in the 1880s when he was born and when Iran was trying to modernize itself, but it was still under a very despotic and even medieval monarchical system. Through the 20th century, it had an early flirtation with constitutional rule and parliament. Mossadegh was involved in all of that. And the other important sort of seminal experiences in the nation's life, and therefore in his life, the attempt by the British to impose a protectorate on the country, which really left a very bad stink in the nose of patriots like him. He came to power in 1951, an old man, having fled office for much of his life because so much of public life was venal and corrupt. But he was propelled to power because he'd managed to get this incredible bill through Parliament, which was to nationalize oil. And oil was everything. It was the honor of the country. It was the hope of the country, the hope for the future. And the Brits were keeping all the lucre for themselves and all the control for themselves. And he came and said that this has got to stop. And the Brits had spent the previous 2 years nationalizing a whole load of industries in the UK after the war. They had a socialist government, but the socialist government was not very socialist abroad and said that it's acceptable for us to nationalize our industries, but not acceptable for you. So they started undermining Mossadegh from the start. At the same time, they were negotiating with him. And Mossadegh's great failing as a leader was his inability to seize the deal. The Americans really wanted him to do a deal because they saw him as a potential friend and they wanted British pride satisfied. And they were brokering this deal, and a lot of diplomatic effort was expended by the US to try and get its two allies to see the road to compromise. And for various reasons, some of them very dramatic, this deal never happened. And when the Eisenhower administration came to power, Churchill was having his last time in power. He was an old man, and he knew what he knew, and he knew that Mussy Duck, as he called him, was a lunatic and that he needed to go. And so he persuaded the Eisenhower administration, or rather MI6 persuaded them, that a coup d'etat should be launched, and it was. And on August the 19th, 1953, Mossadegh succumbed to a combination of military units and mobs that had been hired using CIA dollars. And it always pains Iranians when they realize just how little money the mobs receive. And Mossadegh was sent off into internal exile. He lived until 1967, but he was an unperson. His name was never mentioned, but he hovered like a spectre over politics. And the Shah, as we know, well, you know the story. So that's basically it.
Okay, coming over this way.
Can you speak a little bit about the role of women currently in Iran? It's my understanding it's much diminished from what it used to be.
Before the revolution, the Shah was implementing a lot of projects to educate women. And there was a certain amount was done by the Queen, the Empress. The situation of women was that women had started to become judges, they had entered parliament. It was still an extremely patriarchal society. mean, rhetorically, the way the family worked was still extremely patriarchal, but there were these examples of important women who had achieved prominence. And the entertainment industry, because women were free to sing and to dance and to entertain, were also, there was a strong representation of women there. And with the revolution, a lot of women supported the revolution because, for the reasons that men did, because they thought that the Shah had sold the country to the West and that he was disrespectful, even contemptuous of the country's indigenous traditions and the religion. And there was a time after the revolution when it seemed that Khomeini's forces were going to start erasing more liberal voices from the public sphere. And there was a famous demonstration by women saying that they would not don the hijab, the covering. But that was really the last major sense that you get of liberal-minded women really asserting themselves en masse. But at the same time, something else very interesting was happening. There was a war, there was 8 years of war, and the men were off at the front. So for the reason that women entered the workforce in America in the Second World War, and they entered the workforce in Britain in huge numbers in the Second World War, the same thing happened there. And then the education system expanded hugely. So women were given places at universities to a degree that was unknown. Some of this happened almost unplanned. There was a system of private universities that sprung up, and people wanted to educate their daughters. And so, as you enter the beginning of this decade, you find a strange, paradoxical situation. You find women no longer occupying the top positions, no longer having those trophy positions that they occupied before, but a change in society almost happening of itself as women began to be more autonomous, more educated, to demand more in the family setting, in the setting of the workplace. And a few years ago, this is a very famous statistic, the number of women graduates exceeded the number of male graduates. And they were educated largely alongside their male colleagues. Very different situation from, for example, Saudi Arabia, women driving, but discriminated against legally according to this interpretation of Islamic law that prevails. For example, inheritance, custody, divorce. Those three areas, definitely men retain the advantage. So the situation of women 2.5 years ago, when there were major protests after a disputed election, women took a very prominent role in those protests. They were very visible, very present. Women are definitely an important part of public life in Iran. They're very present, very visible, but they still do not have legal equality with men.
Question from the west side?
In their continuing mischief around the world, how much mischief is the CIA doing internally in Iran right now? And do you think it will lead to anything dastardly like America going to war?
If I knew that, that would mean that I was doing it. So I wouldn't tell you. So you're not going to get much joy from me. I don't know. I can only assume that the CIA are active because they want to know, they want intelligence primarily about how advanced this nuclear program is. I think the idea of a ticking clock, although I think it doesn't convince me entirely, this idea of a ticking clock is so important to the West that they've devoted a lot of energies to trying to find out, to trying to get as much information as they can. And as we know, because it's been made public, the planting of a particularly vicious virus in the computer system that runs part of the centrifuge in the main nuclear site, Stuxnet. That whole operation was a joint CIA Israeli operation. I can only assume that they're extremely active and very concerned. But I do not think, sorry, I'm interrupting you here, but I think that, funnily enough, the lesson of Mossadegh has been learnt to an extent. I don't think you'd ever find, as a CIA person, proposing an action of that kind again, a coup d'etat or a silver bullet of that kind. I think that lesson has been learned.
Hello. You talked a little bit about the media not reporting on the good things that are happening over there. And I know in that region, a lot of the governments are reluctant or untrusting of the media. I do a lot of work with the Jordanian military, trying to help foster transparency and such. Can you talk about some of the barriers, with maybe cultural or whatnot? I know, for instance, it seems as though they're oftentimes take criticism much more personally than we do over here, and so maybe that may be a cultural barrier or whatnot. But can you talk a little bit about the cultural barriers, and maybe what you think as a reporter could be done to increase transparency in the region?
Well, I think I'm not really competent to judge the Jordanian case. With regard to Iran, and you know the differences between Iran and Jordan, they are quite different. But with regard to Iran, I'd say that many people, and it goes back to the Shah's time, the media was never really considered to be an important arm in educating people, in keeping people informed, in preventing corruption, in preventing abuses of power. Those in power regarded it as an aid, as a way of propagandizing, and they distrusted and continue to distrust honest investigative journalism. I think there's been some movement on that score. I think that I know journalists who operate in Iran who play things extremely skillfully, in that they do what I said very rarely happens, which is that the Iranian perspective and the Iranian view is transmitted through them. We're talking about Western journalists. But at the same time, I think that the powers that be understand that a degree of criticism and a degree of reporting about opposition, about dissent, is the price that you pay. And some may even realize the benefits of that, the benefits that that brings. On the question of general transparency, a great many traditional societies, and Middle Eastern societies, I think, are no exception. Islamic societies perhaps more so, because the sanctity of the family is given a special place, to the extent that this very overprotective attitude towards a person's private life. It is extraordinary to me that we don't know more about the family of President Ahmadinejad or the family of the Supreme Leader. They're never mentioned, they're not there. I don't know what the Supreme Leader's wife looks like. There's a sense that the public and the private are entirely separate. And I suppose this leads to this blurring of the line so that corruption can go unreported, because corruption will very often happen between friends or between family members, and it will never get out. So these are some of the issues that concern transparency. I think Iran, in its recent history, was probably most transparent in the beginning of the 2000s, at a time when there was a reformist government. The press was substantially unleashed, and there was an extraordinary debate going on about the way that the country should be run. Opinions, not tittle-tattle about private lives, but real opinions being expressed. And a lot of that is closed down since then. And the reason it's closed down, well, a different lot of people are now in power. And they would also say that, well, the problem with opening up the press is that you introduce a fifth column that can be used by the country's foreign enemies. And the more there is that sense of embattlement, of isolation, of America and Israel and the West wanting ill for the Islamic Republic, the easier it is for me to say, you criticize me, therefore you must be working for a foreign agenda.
Thank you. On the issue of refining and building this nuclear capability that Iran has, I think we're all familiar with what our politicians and our press and in Europe and the US are saying about Iran. But what I'd like to hear, in particular, by the way, I'm talking about the enrichment capabilities, all the centrifuges, and the fact that I think they're enriched 4 times more than they need for power now. I mean, it's up to 22%, I think. But what I want to know is, what does the government of Iran tell its people that it's doing with this power?
Well, the enriched uranium to 20% is explained as needed for medical isotopes. The enrichment program as a whole is explained in terms that Mossadegh would probably understand. It's about independence, it's about energy independence. So then they say, well, you've got enough oil, surely. And then they say, well, it's possible that we would prefer to sell our oil, or that the oil will run out. In any case, we need, this has become it's become a symbol of the virility of Iran. It's about their ability to stand up and say, we're taking our own decisions. So it acquires a kind of internal logic. You can pick apart this decision to have a nuclear program, but when it's going and you've invested so much in it, you're not easily going to be able to give it up. It started under the Shah for the same reason, the reason of simply wanting to be, at that time, the first in the region to have a proper nuclear program. And then with Pakistan and India, and with the arsenal that Israel has, well, a lot of Iranians think, well, whether or not we get a bomb, I mean, why should they have a program and we not? And why should India and Pakistan even enjoy the friendship of America, and Israel the extremely close friendship of America? So part of it is an appeal to nationalist sentiment. The Iranian leadership has said time and again to its own people and to others that they are not interested in having a bomb. Whether the Iranians believe them, or whether they think that it's a decision that might be taken later on, well, we're all just waiting to see. But the point is that when you come this far down the road, you've invested so much political capital in it, to give it up, or to restrict it, or to shackle it, you need something big in return. And that's the problem with the negotiations so far. I don't think the West has been prepared to give enough for the Iranians to turn to their people and say, look what we've got. We've got something, we've acquired something, we've gained something.
In your view, in your knowledge of the Middle East, is there any hope in the near future that the Shiites and the Sunnis will stop abusing one another?
Well, it's a good question. It's a terrible sectarian rivalry that is reflected in the formation of governments, the balance of power, the distribution of spoils. There is differences in doctrine between the two sects, and hardline Sunnis such as Al-Qaeda and the real hardliners will not be in a room with a Shia, which incidentally is one reason why it is absurd, as we hear so often, for Iran to be lumped together with Al-Qaeda and other groups like that. They hate each other's guts. I'm sure there is a way, in the way that Catholics and Protestants learnt to live together after abusing each other for so long. I'm sure there is a way. And I think a starting point is for governments to respect the rights of their minorities. And too often governments in the region reflect only the will of the majority and look unfavorably on the others. And when the minority is as big and in some places as powerful as the Shia, then that acquires a much more venomous edge. If you look in Egypt, where we have a new democratic government, well, Morsi he's concerned for his constituency. Does he care about the Christians, the Copts? And the same thing happens everywhere. It really is about that institutionalized concern for the plight of the minority. And in most countries, as you know, the Shia are a minority. In Iraq, they're a majority. And Iraq is, in some ways, just a tragic, exceptional case, in that from its formation, it was a dog's dinner. And no one is really quite sure why Iraq exists, whether it should exist, how it could possibly be turned into a success story. Because you have these three competing groups, the Shia Arabs, the Sunni Arabs, and the Kurds, and you can't easily disentangle them. So I don't have an easy answer, I'm afraid. But I, like you, am very depressed by it.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. We have here.
You mentioned the treatment of minorities. How are Christians treated and looked at in Iran?
Iran, and this will shock you, doesn't have a bad record when it comes to looking after Christians and Jews. Quite a lot of Christians there, they're mostly Armenian Christians. And they are protected by law, they have a representative in parliament. The Armenian Christian population of Iran is probably the only Christian population in the Middle East that is not fleeing for its life. So that tells you something. There are small numbers of Jews, a great many of them left, as you would imagine, after the revolution, and a great many of them ended up either in the West or in Israel. But they too are protected by law. They may feel uncomfortable, they may not wish to speak to journalists, because they know that the slightest sign of disloyalty will be looked upon without much favor. But they do have their schools, they do have their freedom of worship and freedom of association. So to that extent, it's not so bad a picture.
If it's comfortable, could you please tell us about your spiritual path to Islam?
It's news to me. Where did you get that from? Oh, right. Well, I don't know who put it there. It's very comfortable, but I don't know what it would be. I would have to make it up. Are you sure it's about me, that program? No.
He converted to Iranian Shiism.
He converted to Iranian Shiism, a sect of Islam, in the early part of this decade.
That's not you.
This decade. News to me. I'm sorry. I mean, you're perfectly at liberty. If it's in the program, it's, you know.
Well, another question, now a little easier. What would you like us to take away from tonight's talk?
I think if that's a way of saying what would be your closing remarks, I suppose I would say that addressing a group of people who represent an elite in their state and in their town, and looking to you for leadership when it comes to spreading and helping the spread of ideas, because you have access and you have your networks, professional and personal. I think it is to always try and examine the received wisdom and see how correct it is. And this, I suppose, although I thought the film was highly entertaining, a really good yarn, and skillfully done, I suppose this is where the film Argo didn't satisfy me, because it didn't take us forward. It didn't suggest anything new. It didn't offer any new insight. The Iranians were just the same old, nasty, horrible fanatics. And that is an incomplete picture. And what we should try and do is complete the picture in the same way that the Iranians need to complete their picture of the United States and the rest of the world.